So Rafa, you may as well start now.
Thank you. So welcome to our Conjunctures Zoom talk. It's an honor to have Professor Babette Babich with us, sharing the talk, The Devil News Apartments on Gnther Anders and Rilke's Angels. So let me introduce her. Babette Babich is Professor of Philosophy at Fordham University, visiting Professor of Theology, Religion and Philosophy at the University of Winchester in the UK, and she teaches on occasion at the Humboldt University in Berlin. She's author of 11 books, most recently Gnther Anders' Philosophy of Technology and Nietzsche's Plastic. She's editor of 14 collective volumes, including most recently reading David Hume's of the Standard of Tests and Hermeneutic Philosophies of Social Science. She's executive editor of the journal New Nietzsche Studies. So after presentation, we'll be open for questions and comments. And Professor Babette, thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much for that very, very kind introduction. I'm also, I have to say, grateful to everyone, but there's also the case also to Professor, what have I done? I've done something terrible, but it's not going to work. I need to share a screen. Is that going to be okay for people if I do that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. The reason I want to do this is because it will allow some of the things that I present to be seen. And that can be helpful as well. Okay. I am grateful to Professor Nythamar de Oliveira and to everyone here for your attention. I want to apologize that I am not speaking the Brazilian language because I cannot speak Portuguese. I have French and a little Italian and a lot of German. So my admiration for everyone here is boundless because you're crossing not only Zoom timelines, but also linguistic ones. I should also underline my particular pleasure in joining this series because the other speakers are extraordinarily impressive, but I also want to say thank you and I want to say a word about this because Professor Nythamar de Oliveira and myself are admirers of the late and great David Allison. So he was a cool friend, but we both appreciated. For this lecture, I'm going to be drawing on several chapters in a book that has recently been published on Gnther Anders' Philosophy of Technology. There it is. Quite because, just on what you all know, your invitation that was extended to me is in the context of this semester and the kinds of things you're going to be listening to. And Anders himself is concerned with theology in addition to the political and the ethical. So he covers all of the bases, not every one of them, but a lot of them. The first section is Gnther Anders and Heidegger's pseudo-concreteness. He's making fun. Pseudo-concreteness. It was with respect to what Hannah Arendt named the human condition, that a former student of Heidegger's, and that gives us the younger Gnther Anders, when he was visiting Japan just after the war, who was also Hannah Arendt's first husband, would decry in his book, Die Antiquiertheit is mentioned, Heidegger's pseudo-concreteness, and in a chapter he published the same in English on that same topic, the same year he published this book, 1956. This is a complex rebuke. It's a problem for us because Heidegger seems so very directly concrete, all that what Dave Allison, that's the reason I had to mention him, would call cheap ontic stuff, right? Things, everyday things. Complementing Heidegger's focus on fundamental ontology, so much so that many scholars to this day think that Heidegger was a German existentialist. Of course, he wasn't, but a lot of people, there's a whole book on that saying he is. Thus, we can read of Dasein. And the German, das Wesen dieses Seienden liegt in seinem Zusein. Right? Clearly, the essence of this entity, this Dasein, lies in its to be. I'm going to cue in here just to help us understand the point. An old and wonderful film that maybe when you're bored, you can take a look at if you haven't seen it already, dates from 1942, To Be or Not to Be. That's Ernst Lubitsch, and that's Jack Benny, who plays Hamlet in the film. The dark comedy is not gratuitous. This is not just an empty joke. It's essential. It is a joke, but it's not just empty. And the allusion to Shakespeare is crucial because its issue in its being for itself, Dasein, is thereby distinctive in its overt mineness. And that's actually key to Heidegger's definition. Yea, meines, each and every time mine. Specifically, meines wiederum je in diese oder jene Weise zu sein, mine to be in one way or another. However I want it to be, it's mine. But despite the immediacy of the being to be investigated, for Heidegger, nota bene, that's for the sake of the Seinsfrage, the being question, the me in each case can tend to be always, already, even as mine, unowned as such. That means uneigentlich, not mine. Thus, Anders was well aware of this, following Heidegger, emphasizes that very important point, even, he's writing on essence and authenticity, even in its fullest concretion, Dasein can be characterized by inauthenticity. So in its fullest concretion, most of the time, Dasein's inauthentic. Now, that means most of the time, Dasein's not itself. Most of the time, Dasein is inauthentic. Complicating matters, Heidegger himself says inauthenticity does not indicate a lower degree of being, niedrigeren Seinsgrad. It's not lower, it's not less. Much rather, and here Heidegger uses the language of the concrete as Anders takes this up, inauthenticity, according to Heidegger, determines Dasein in its fullest concretion. And he uses the word Konkretion, which is exactly where Anders gets it from. That is very interesting. When busy, when excited, when interested, when ready for enjoyment. And there's a whole, there's a whole phenomenological potentiality right there. Very fascinating. Heidegger reminds us of a perplexing reflex towards the conclusion of Augustine's Confessions, asking what, after all, could be closer to me than myself, to myself, quid autem propinquius me ipso mihi. We know, all of us, or we should know, Augustine's answer. If it's also commonly underread or passed over, note here the beauty of the formula, especially confounding for Augustine himself, who constantly submits his text as such before God. It's like Rousseau is depositing it in Paris, but Augustine deposits it before God. Mihi, quistio factus sum, a question I have become to myself. Augustine's reflection on time, which is part of what's going on there, includes a variation on the same questioning after himself, repeating his own proximity to himself. The logical proximity of minus, what's mine, me, what I am to myself, a question, coincident immediacy, concrete presence, is all a part of that, and it's key. In the same way, the notion of mineness seems to invite Heidegger's reader to read along with him. This is why we are able to criticize him so easily. Free to fault Heidegger's observations, as Anders does, as many do, who better than ourselves? Thus, Augustine's writerly style can seem a literal confession. Totally not true. It was totally not a confession. Almost all of it was a fabrication or convention. Even as Pierre Hadot reminds us, not that he invented that, Pierre Hadot was influential for Foucault, but via Pierre Courcelle, that in the case of Augustine, this is utterly ahistorical. None of it coincides with the facts. Okay. Well, we have problems. Who was Gnther Anders? Let's start there. Anders, and this tends to be necessary to point out, is typically overlooked. We never heard of the guy. He was famous perhaps for having had important family connections. He was, I think you can see the family resemblance here a little bit. Walter Benjamin means cousin, right? Very crucial thing. In addition, having been Hannah Arendt's, I mentioned that already, ex-husband, and he was son of a really famous guy who invented the most important thing in education, namely the IQ test, William Stern. So he was famous for everyone else he was related to, or Heidegger or Husserl. In his work throughout his lifetime, Anders engaged the horrors of war, but not less, he took on the overwhelming academic insensitivity to such horrors. We professors actually don't really care enough, according to Anders, about any of that. Foregrounded, just before he died, a couple of years before he died, in 1985, on the blindness, incidental or deliberate, that characterized some of his own teachers and those he was influenced by, not just Husserl, not just Heidegger, but in particular Georg Simmel and Max Scheler. As Anders argued, because both of these guys advocated on behalf of the First World War. They were for it, cheering not only its outset, but throughout. As Anders writes in Die Kirchenschlacht, the cherry slaughter, his memorial engagement with eulogy for Hannah Arendt. We'll talk about that again a little later. There's a lot of debate in the corners of Anders' scholarship and publication, publishers' care, it's very important, concerning the way to best translate a book. One of my teachers, Don Eide at Stony Brook, sought to ban, to block from English translation. He's so far been very successful. The Antiquiertheit, there's mention. So he's managed to do that for 65 years to keep it out of English. The obsolescence of the human, people tend to think that's how you should render Die Antiquiertheit, because that's really the French titling, and that bleeds over into the English. But the trouble is that the term obsolescence exists in German, and it means just what it means in English. And one can and should consider planned obsolescence. The inkjet, if you have one of these, you know that these things are designed to die. Not only the inkjets, but the inkjet printer itself expires after 2 years, and you have to get a new one. I argue that antiquatedness is closer, rather as if the human today no longer required, quite as Jean Beaufret asked Heidegger whether meaning or sense could be restored to the term humanism. The very idea of the human today seems out of date. The French also say périmé. This outdatedness haunts Anders' question concerning Simmel and Scheler and their position on the question of war, to quote Anders, and it's what he says, and more importantly, it's how he says it that requires attention. He says that they were sufficiently clever enough to have found the means to have remained so very naive in order to allow themselves to be abused as bona fide, free whores. That means whores you don't have to pay for. It's very important in Anders' lexicon. So this volume is never coming out because that's the second volume. And if we ever get the first volume, who knows? Calling thinkers like Scheler and Simmel whores seems excessive, to say the least. The reference to calculated advantage, to selling oneself as a philosopher, but in the case of Anders for free, at one's own expense, cuts to the quick of the problem, as Max Weber underlines this. This is the point of Wissenschaft als Beruf, scholarship as vocation or science as vocation. Nor is it anything new. Already in the 2nd century, Lucian wrote an entire wonderful dialogue about philosophies for sale. Give philosophers money and they'll say anything, said Lucian, already 2nd century AD. The trouble, as Anders, who didn't have a job and didn't have an appointment, was very free to notice, was the practice of philosophy as a profession, a paid gig where you demand to be paid, not a vocation one follows for the love of it, as Anders did. To the same extent, the great majority, by far, nearly all philosophers in Germany during the war, as everywhere else before, and above all after the war, took the side of the winners. I always vote on the side of the winners. What the great naive, as Anders describes, what used to be called the establishment. So despite their position, very privileged, they're not really critical, which is a kind of funny thing. Anders proceeded to explicate what he called Scheler's dictum, arguing that it was crystallized in the contrast between his own disposition to believe, as he did, as Scheler did, in the devil, in contrast to the theologians of his own generation who believed in the existence of God, but not in the devil. That's again from that 2nd volume. Dependent on Scheler, and I would say dependent also on Heidegger, Anders proceeds to cite Denis de Rougemont on the idea of the devil in American society. The devil's first trick, remarks André Gide, because he's French. The French never talk in their own voice. They're always quoting someone. And in this case, de Rougemont is quoting Gide, and of course, everybody's quoting Baudelaire, is to make us believe that he does not exist. This trick has never better succeeded, and that's the key, than in the modern epoch. All America has fallen into this snare. We really don't believe in the devil. So evil seems right, and this is the point here, when it comes to speaking of the Holocaust. But otherwise, in an age of non-believers, evil, the word, the idea, seems antiquated, outmoded, apart from, as with Hans Jonas, Gnosticism and magically anticipatory catastrophism, especially given the fact that it was the US that dropped the bomb. These days, the COVID-19 crisis simply and without fanfare has managed to update the point. No effort from Anders or me, shutting down the Vatican itself, most conspicuously perhaps, for those interested in theological punctuations or Straussians, on Easter Sunday, 2020, along with all other churches, synagogues, temples, mosques. Thus, Anders' formula for the devil's new apartment, the Teufel hat eine neue Wohnung bezogen, may be read in an era, that's our era, that takes zombie pandemics in stride. Virtually speaking, we did all of this on the internet with The Walking Dead and a televised version of Primetime Apocalypse with the 2019 BBC series Good Omens, all about an angel and a devil who became bodies, and counting out the deaths of folk deities with the still running, I don't know, American gods, along with Twilight and True Blood and Harry Potter and his magical school for warlocks and witches, Hogwarts, complete with all the incantations and wand waving against which Severus Snape notoriously warned his students. And why not? We've had orcs and half orcs for years. Maybe if you're a gamer, you have the complete set. It's possible. I don't know. What was once fiction for readers of Tolkien, an amused provocation for C.S. Lewis with his Screwtape and his version of his Wormwood, the Junior Devil, which is not the same, that Junior Devil, as Alan Rickman's invocation of the same stuff, very important, because just happens to be an infusion, right? It's not powdered. It's not a bit of herb. It's got to be in a tincture. Very, very important thing for those of you who care about that. That's the herbal basis of what we call ivermectin or absinthe. That's its name, absinthia. This is Artemisia absinthium, otherwise known as absinthe wormwood. Now, all of that is harmlessly, well, it's been banned actually in Switzerland and France for a long time, but it's harmlessly, we imagine, lodged in our collective unconscious. This is also AI, gaming fantasies. Now, citing Baudelaire, the source Pache Arendt, who misses the reference, she doesn't get it herself, so it's okay that we don't. For de Rougemont's repurposing of Gide, we read, Baudelaire, my dear brothers, never forget, as you undertake to vaunt enlightenment progress, that the most beautiful of the devil's tricks is to persuade you that he doesn't exist. Now, speaking of the devil is a German commonplace. Ever since the Bible was translated, it's an ejaculation, some Teufel, including post-Luther, a vulgar dimensionality. Anders takes this over from Luther, but also from Goethe, who writes his Mephisto with a touch of urbanity and bumbling pathos requisite for sympathy well beyond Milton's tragic Satan in his Paradise Lost. Just a moment ago, I quoted Anders on Mark Scheler and the devil, and the formula also appears in Kafka and in Buber's 1953 expression of the age of God's eclipse, along with Sartre's writerly vision of nihilism, hell itself, and the durably wretched claim that other people would suffice for this classically. And for Sartre, he contrasts le diable et le bon Dieu. For Anders, we disattend to the category of evil just where We think we've nailed it down with Nazis and Eichmann, or following the Black Notebooks with Heidegger. The point is both Ernst Bloch and Gnther Anders remind us, they agree in this one thing, is that by assigning the lion's share of evil to Hitler or Heidegger, it doesn't matter. One may be seduced, or the people who won't get vaccinated, it doesn't matter. One may be seduced into the confident illusion. We have this in the meme that was popular in 2020 in the summer, hunting Nazis, punching Nazis. So one has thereby permanently categorized and enclosed it. If everything that is to be done to repeat Adorno's expression, as so many others have emphasized the point, is to undertake in order to ensure that it never happens again, one has created a pseudo, we should say, primal scene, one that can be neatly cordoned off, identified as if on an old map of ocean monsters. There is where evil lurks, but here is where we find ourselves. Now, it remains rare for scholars to talk about Hiroshima, never mind Chernobyl, as Anders did. Some of us may talk about climate change, but most of us take care not to mention, as few do, and I'm going to come back to this, the ongoing and accelerating circumstance of both weather control and weather multipliers effected by spraying accelerants on trees for years and years in the fire disasters in California, in Greece, in Australia. That's too dangerous. We'd rather not go there. Who today, which academic, which philosopher here and now, that is since March of 2020, has cared to raise the question of what we have done and what we as a global society are doing to the old and the sick, apart from Giorgio Agamben, who did ask and does ask, and who has been vilified as a result in an era of social media programmed and thus organized hysteria. Pro-mandatory masks, pro-mandatory testing, pro-mandatory, that means forced vaccinations, all in response to one disease, a single pathogen, somehow supposed singularly responsible for all death as such. This is a stunning complicity in statistics and for overwhelming medical facilities in potentia, unless all manner of fascist measures be undertaken on a global scale, including, and this is where the Anders connection comes in, individual self-incarceration, lockdown and quarantine, the prohibition of movement and social interaction of the most everyday kind, in addition to the pursuit of one's livelihood, including art and theater. Agamben also writes on this, as well as face-to-face teaching, especially in the United States. Human as we are we allied with the divine image and likeness? As Nietzsche mused in recollecting his youthful theodistical variation on good and evil, as Anders contemplated the fact not merely of Auschwitz, but also of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the ongoing instantiation of nuclear violence via nuclear reactors in the then case of Chernobyl, which is still with us, in fact, like 3 Mile Island and Fukushima, because radiation is effectively always, but the point is not to, that's the point for us, not to talk about it. As Anders maintained, thinking of Fukushima, in his Gewalt, ja oder nein, which was of course about Chernobyl. Is there evil within us? The tradition that sets the devil as the prince Fürst dieser Welt, the prince of the world. This is not by accident the title of Jacob Tauber's edited collection on Karl Schmidt. Seems frighteningly fitting. Again, consider only the burning of Australia with wildfires abetted by months and years of chemical accelerants in the trees, followed by the wholesale persecution of its wildlife. You don't have to conserve wildlife if they all burn to death. It's wonderful for development. Nothing seems to hinder our willingness, as Anders argues, to do the devil's work for him. The next section is Rilke's Duino elegies and the strength of angelic Dasein. I'm going to turn now to Rilke's angels in connection with Benjamin and Clay, and Hannah Arendt, because Anders, then under the name he was born with, Günther Stern, together with Hannah Arendt, wrote in 1930, the two of them together, on Rilke. Talking of his angels, Rilke also talks of the soul of the night. Thus, Rilke's quite self-conscious, lyrical, musical echo of the very first verse of Hölderlin's Brot und Wein, which was for almost 100 years the only part you could read, originally titled To the Night, An die Nacht. We'll see that picture of our loving pair together a little later. Hölderlin's motifs in these few lines, it's just the first verse, sketch questions of economy, it's very Swabian, und Gewinn und Verlust weget ein sinniges Haupt. And you really need to learn to read Hölderlin the way Heidegger would read him to catch that weget. Matching Hölderlin's Swabian sensibility, weighing profit and loss. A mindful, sensible head attuned to weigh the balance, the satisfactions of the market, thinks back on the day. As the night goes on, before the watcher calls the hour, in the same verse, Hölderlin continues to trace distance, ambiguity, memory. The resonance is stunningly beautiful, but the play of strings sounds distantly from the gardens. Think of Tübingen, because that's where he was. Perhaps that there a lover plays, or a solitary man, thinking of faraway friends and days of youth. We can hear Hölderlin's echoing with Rilke's violin in passing in the Geoengineering. For Anders, the religious world, he says this several times, is an acoustic world. You've got to listen. There is a clear ambiguity in relation to the divine, and thus the patent or seeming lack of answer. That's part and parcel of what Anders called the situation, Heidegger 2, Jaspers 2, Adorno 2. Again, we note the term situation in which one seeks God. Where are you when you look for God? As Anders writes, together with Arendt, and the dialogue between them subtends the argument in their joint reflection on Rilke's Meteorologies, given their allusion to questioning in Rilke and thereby in Heidegger, as the kind of question that must be heard in the poet's word, in the form of a question that no longer hopes for an answer. Still, the question does not perish from lack of an answer, rather it survives as disquietude, suddenly changing into despair at the very moment of encounterability, the German matters, Treffbarkeit of God. The resonance seems unmistakable in connection with the beginning reflections of Anders' introduction to the text. He had meant for his habilitation, he writes, he doesn't get habilitated. He doesn't say it's the Nazis. He actually says it's a lot of other people in front of him concerning musical situations. There we read the same dialectical tension. He names die Situation des Zugleich, the situation of the at once, simultaneously at the same time, same moment, where his specific concern is to reflect the simultaneous circumstance of being not surely in the world, in Welt, but in Musik. Okay, that's in Anders Arendt, but of course the language is utterly related to that. The tenor of sheer encounterability, Treffbarkeit, traced in Rilke's faintingly uncanny perishing from his stronger existence, von seinem stärkeren Dasein, Anders and Arendt explain with reference to nothing other than Anders' own notion of being in the world as in music, with the hyphen, in music, a specific being, hyphen, in, hyphen, hearing, when you're utterly absorbed by what you hear. That is, this something consists in an instance of hearing, being in hearing, in Ständigkeit des Hörens, im Hörensein. Today, there has to be a condition and an occasion for being in hearing. That's a compound. Next section is elegies, poetry and hearing, poetry and the Shema. That's where we're going to try to go. Here it's with collecting Arendt's reflection on Kafka, Karl Kraus, and Walter Benjamin. She's talking truth, and she's talking Heidegger along with the specifically Benjaminian secret of truth, but it's the acoustic that's worth noting. That's why I want to keep that word schma there. Between accents and intonations, Arendt herself will invoke various German dialects. If you go to the north of Germany, you won't understand people as easily from the south of Germany. You will if they know you don't speak German, because they just will speak to you in an Annotations German. They won't allow you to hear what they really sound like. Mundarten, the art of the mouth. She proceeds to explain, once this truth had come into the human world, at the appropriate moment in history, be it as the Greek, aletheia, visually perceptible to the eyes of the mind and comprehended by us as unconcealment. Aletheia always carries a mirror or some kind of representation, Unverborgenheit, Heidegger, or, and this is the difference between the Greek and, of course, Judaism, Christianity, they're the same in this context, the acoustically perceptible word of God, as we know it from the European religions of revelation. That's Arendt herself. With reference to Anders and Heidegger and Rilke, reference to religion and to Judaism, for Arendt, the more important emphasis is complicated beyond the immediate context here and has to await a full and fully integrated biography of Anders. And you can't really have a biography of Hannah Arendt without a biography of Anders, and we don't have one. So it's a lot of interesting things will happen in the future. What's key in Arendt's distinction between the visually perceptible, as she talks about it here, and the acoustically perceptible is Anders' observation that Rilke's world is, like every religious world, an acoustic world. And it is in the same heard or acoustic sense that we should not fail to read, or better said, fail to hear the first lines as commentary on the prayer, Hear Israel, Shema Yisrael, the conscious renunciation of the demand to be heard, the despair at not being able to be heard, and finally the need to speak even without an answer. These are the real reasons for the darkness, asperity, and tension of the style in which the poetry indicates its own possibilities and its will to form. The kind of dialectic, the kind of ambiguity, is that in direct proximity, continuity with the divine, and Heidegger's specific kind of questioning may also be heard in the reflection on the seeming lack of answer. I've given a slide here because it's a complicated sentence. The lack of answer which attends the moment, Anders would say, the situation in which one prays. Where are you when you pray? Where are you when you seek God? A petition given, as we cited it earlier, to quote Arendt and Anders again, in the form of a question that no longer hopes for an answer. If all of this, including the very possibility of an encounter with a deity, physical as this is, including breath, space, creaturely encounter, again, and note the modality, Treffbarkeit, is at least fairly esoteric, Rilke's poem also would have seemed almost obvious for, I said this picture was coming back, the newly married stars. So whenever Rilke talks about stars, these two think he's talking to them. Stars. Thus we read Sternen. We read a clear reflection on the audible, using Anders' language of Zuhören. The text begins by emphasizing the poem's musical key, and one hears elements of Benjamin's Angel of History. Listening is so little bound to an object that on the contrary, it receives eine ununterbrochene Nachricht, die aus Stille sich bildet. And that's, of course, the key thing from the first elegy, the ceaseless message that forms itself out of silence, whenever the objects are lost and blown away. It's not listening to a particular articulated message, rather, it is a listening to the urgent beseeching of a heart. This is 1930. Höre, mein Herz, listen, my heart. Therefore, a mode of being, so waren sie hörend. Such was their listening. We could also translate that as such was their obedience, such was their observance. Complicated term. Indeed, as a state of being, they go on to say, listening is already its own fulfillment, since if you're really listening, it pays no attention, if you're really listening, to whether its beseeching may be heard. Fairly important and frightening notion. Now, that's I think I've lost something, but I'm going to see what I've gone. Something this happens. For both of the readers, and here there's a full resonance of the theological and the acoustical, logical dimension that would speak the correspondence between the two. We read, indeed, I knew I was too fast, as a state of being, listening is already its own fulfillment, since it pays no attention. Once again, we already said that. And that's the same thing. If a friend asks you for advice and you notice that they don't care what you say, it's because they never do, and they never can. It's not important what you say. It's just important that you listen, which is depressing, right? So, but psychoanalysts know this. This is abandonment to deity. Angels know this, God knows this. And it's also the abandonment intrinsic to the immanence of love. We may think we can hear Anders alone as we read, and that's even though it's Anders Arendt or Stern, it's actually under the name of Stern, but he writes it in his own hand. It's in his handwriting, not hers. And it's his formulation that rescued something that the poet is able to wrest from the then current religiously alienated situation. And now we have a complicated question on this joint reflection. It is certainly the two of them together, unutterably phenomenological something that consists in an instance of hearing being in hearing. Again, they repeat, I'm not just repeating, but they repeat it twice in Ständigkeit des Hörens, im Hörensein. Today, there has to be a condition and an occasion for being in hearing. It's a repetition in their text in place of a complete objectlessness for which our heart is no longer adequate. The occasion for being in hearing becomes the disappearance of the object, which, this is the intentionality, we pursue with our ears. Very, very, very important reflection. This is written by the two, but it's in Anders' voice, full intentionality, full musicality, a voice in dialogue with the beloved. I have a giant section I'm cutting. Elsewhere, and anyone who wants to send me an email, it's very easy to do. I have raised the question, and it's far from simple. What's a poet? Who's a poet? Rereading Heidegger and Leonard Cohen, you want it darker. As Heidegger reflects, years after Heidegger, it reads, if he ever read, we don't know, how would we know? I think he maybe did, Arendt and Anders on poets, on Rilke, in a needful dürftige Zeit, because of course, when Heidegger writes on what's wohl zu Dichter, he's really only talking about Rilke, the same poet they're writing about. He asks, is R.M. Rilke, gives us his initials, a poet in a needful time? How is his poetry related to the indigence of the age? How far does it reach into the abyss? Where does the poet arrive? Granted that he goes where he can go. Notice the modal one time. We can think we know what this means, but who are our poets today? And that's a real question for us in our current very dark times as we're living them, muffled and blinded as we are. For Heidegger, and intriguingly, his reflection, only published in 1946 in Holzwege, offers, one can only wonder if he means the reference to be heard by Arendt and therefore by Anders, as his essay includes, this is striking, one of Heidegger's very rare, very few musical references. In addition to his own poetically staccato-like allusions to Nietzsche and to Hölderlin, needful remains, this is Heidegger, the time, not only because God is dead, but because even mortals barely know or have the capability of their own mortality. Still, have mortals not taken possession of their own nature, death withdrawals into the mysterious. The secret of pain remains covered. Love is not learned, but mortals are. They are insofar as language is. Song yet dwells over the needy land. The word of the singer still retains the trace of the holy. What's interesting is that rather than love, and rather than the profit and loss of the day, in English, we don't need Hölderlin, we can think of Thomas Carlyle. So here hath been dawning another blue day. Think, wilt thou let it slip useless away? You got to be an economist to understand that. The measured word induces such economies, calculations. Heidegger cites Rilke's poetic indictment of technology and venality, more economy, finitude and mortality. It's complicated. It's Heidegger, after all. But Rilke's fragment reflects on the pain of things. Anders will later in his reconstructed dialogue with Arendt, as we turn to this below, that's Die Kirchenschlacht, Dialoge, the cherry slaughter with Hannah Arendt, emphasizes the bits, the pieces, Stücke. And Heidegger cites Rilke's reflection on the faded sovereigns, the kings, who we could almost be talking Bitcoin, playing digital musical chairs with poetry and thought. The reflection on the angel for Heidegger restores a certain balance. After alluding to Nietzsche by speaking of calculating will, Heidegger likes to make Nietzsche into a calculator, as if this calculation had been Nietzsche's concern, and may, as it proceeds, help us, as Heidegger quotes Rilke's late period. He writes, when from the salesman's hand the balance goes over to that angel who, in the heavens, stills and gentles it with the trade of space. There's a lot that you could analyze there. Next section, between angelic and satanic, the devil's new apartment. The book on Anders, I have the book here, that's what it looks like, this is the book. And technology has a last chapter, all books have a last chapter. If in the case of this book, it's followed by all the annotations, they had no footnotes, just the endnotes, unfortunately, out of context, like the ghosts of afterthoughts. It has no conclusion, last chapter, but no conclusion. Now, philosophers have the habit of writing as if their concerns, truth and justice and love, were the most important of all themes, as if everyone shared the philosopher's questioning concerning whether it's better to be, think of Plato, just or unjust, the certainty of knowing, think of Aristotle, why beings are, Aristotle or Parmenides. This has never been entirely correct. Heraclitus complains more bitterly about this, as does Empedocles, but Plato outdoes either. And Kant, as Nietzsche wrote a little unkindly in his book of jokes, The Gay Science, about Kant's joke, Kant wanted to prove in a way that would dumbfound the common man, that the common man was right. That was the secret of his soul. He wrote against the scholars and in support of popular prejudice, but for scholars and not for the people. Nietzsche's critique of, in this case, refers to Kant's critique, contra the entire edifice of metaphysics. And even scholars do not always grasp what's going on in Kant. Nietzsche, by contrast, does. Here, the point is only that philosophy has been working with such conceits since its inception, literally for thousands of years. For his part, as noted, and this remains alienating even for scholars who are concerned with theology and philosophy of religion, not to mention ethics or political theory, Anders was concerned with unpopular causes that he considered all important, nuclear violence, by which Anders meant the sheer capacity for nuclear destruction, that is to say, the bomb, but no less in terms of such capacity. He also meant the deployment of nuclear power plants, contra the fantasy that such undertakings might be positive or peaceful, because they couldn't possibly be, as he argues, and as we continue to imagine, because it's got to work, it's got to be safe and effective, in spite of Chernobyl and other disasters, in spite of Fukushima, a disaster with consequences so extreme, we have chosen not to think of it. Same question for the question of nuclear waste that has since 1945 not been solved. We do not know in any country in the world how to dispose of nuclear waste. Think Yucca Mountain, unresolved. In general, we have trouble with waste, we have trouble with garbage. But few philosophers post-World War II, apart from Anders, have cared to care about the bomb or complications of atomic reactors. Maybe Daniel Berrigan cared. He was at Fordham until his death. But a worry about nuclear power has not been philosophically popular, not even in liberation theology. On the level of global endangerment, it is argued in all good conscience, when it's mentioned at all, that climate change, the weather, demands overt geoengineering as opposed to the covert or secret kind already in play. And thus Anders insists that the only way to fight the poison we manufacture, what Sloterdijk rightly called our human expectorations, has to be, that's what we think, with technology. Not with stopping, as I argue, ceasing our drilling, ceasing our fracking, stopping the cutting and burning of forests, ceasing the mining of rare earths, stopping the raising and killing of animals on an industrial scale, stopping the trawling and seizing repeatedly and massively of all manner of ocean creatures on factory processing ships. See, this seems like it's too much, but what's too much is that we're doing it. And stopping above all the poisoning, that is the idea of geoengineering via atmospheric dispersants, what Sloterdijk calls black meteorology, and the way, as he says, aircraft unfold airspace. That's a quote, coupled with radio frequencies, scalar transmitters, and so on. To the same extent, Anders' observation that the devil has moved into a new apartment is bound to remain with us even as we dismiss it, because we don't believe in such things as the devil. The dark star that followed Anders seems to be reflected in this notion, more than banal, of a new locus of evil corresponding to our complacency with vaccine mandates. Note how much more efficient these are than mere chemical dispersants. Whatever's in the chemtrails that falls down slowly on our heads can be injected directly into your arm. Along with passports to ensure compliance, our support of nuclear technology, both bombs and energy, our tolerance of not only weather manipulations, human-animal hybrids, as Anders speaks of these already in his lifetime. Strangely, Anders actually writes about the making of these creatures that have percentages of pig or mouse, or a number of other types of animals. It's this that makes the human antiquated, but also drone and other attacks. All this would seem to ensure that we must be counted, all of us. This is what Anders says, each one of us, as so many new sons of Eichmann. That's what he calls us, implicated by our inaction, even if we name that non-action by the fetish name nonviolence, peaceful resistance, sleepwalking. The term sleepwalking, quote unquote, is Sloterdijk's. And unlike most modern thinkers, including Heidegger, who we should recall explicitly denies the connection between technology and deviltry, Anders' quotes go back to this one more time to conclude Max Scheler, who emphasized that he maintained a belief in the devil. The point of invoking the locus of the devil's new apartment is that the devil is no longer to be found where we traditionally might have expected to find him. His new apartment is the one next door to our own. And even if, as Anders says, we try to smoke him out under our noses as he is, you can find him in the mask on your face and your neighbor's face. The devil's easier to miss than ever before. In his Kafka book, and this is unsettling, Anders reminds us that it is imperative to recognize that it is not only war, thank you, Clausewitz, that continues under another name. Thus, he writes, quite with Nietzsche in mind, that it is the particular stage of disbelief reached at any given time that is itself interpreted in a religious light. Nature, though neither created by God nor inhabited by any specifically divine presence, still awakens diffusely religious sentiments, or else the twilight of the gods has apocalyptic and therefore religious significance, or man, the human, heroically confronting the ultimate nothingness becomes the object of a mystique. The belief in a Superman, the Übermensch, or finally unable to find God, the poet sings the mysterious lament of Rilke's poems, in which the singing itself becomes an act of praise for the divine absence. That's Anders Franz Kafka, and it's been in English for many years, so I have to quote that translation. This, as Anders concluded in the second volume of Human Antiquatedness, Outdatedness, is not our redemption, but our doom. For Anders, who also had recourse to the figure of Benjamin's angel of history and his notion of historians turned toward the future, everything would turn on whether we might be capable of a newly phenomenological hermeneutics, able to describe in the machines of today the humanity coined by the same, not to be part of this new future, not to hack it, but for the sake of an interruption. That's his word. The problem is not simply climate change, but geoengineering. The problem is the way we make the climate to change, the way we shift the weather, seeding clouds, targeted or direct energy weapons, firestorms and earthquakes, and other deeds so marvelous that most of us prefer to believe they're impossible to do, or if not, that those who could do them as the real kings of the world would never use such tactics, no more than, so we imagine, they would ever use bioweapons, release gain-of-function enhanced viruses into a population, or, just 2 weeks ago, gas into the subways of New York City for a period of 2 weeks, just a test, just a week or so. Actually, it's more recently than 2 weeks ago, it's just a week or so, when they did this last, just to count events we know about. Or think of the new street lamps. Almost all of them have a little bar. It's out of my photograph I just took. On the top of them everywhere, along with, these are brand new, 5G and soon 6G. They're not just putting them on the top now, they're putting them on the side of the building, and so on, multiplied, to use the military expression of choice. The problem is the wearing of masks, complicity with lockdown regimes, self-monitored and self-imposed quarantines. You are your own unpaid prison guard. The problem is the susceptibility to social media manipulation. The problem is the shunning of the old and the ill by agreeing to prohibitions against hospital visits and care home visits. The problem is agreeing to Zoom one's lectures, agreeing to a simulacrum of life, to virtually teach, to love, to theorize, to socialize online. The problem is the shunning of the unvaccinated, the complicity with various green passes, as if this were not the latest kind of apartheid. This is the softest war against the all, that is against, in Adorno's words, they, the people, that has ever been undertaken. And it's soft because it can be. There is no resistance. Or if there is, it is not in fact televised, because more than ever before, what is and what is not televised can be controlled before, during, and after the fact. I've brought the question of Rilke and his angels beyond the analysis Anders gives us to the more concrete reality following Anders in the world around us, because just this, including the human being as a certain natural resource of choice via gene modification, as this was the concern Anders had, he made his arguments, his philosophical arguments, cut too close for comfort, once again, including us, all of us, and not merely some demonized other. If Anders himself would not claim a high likelihood for success in the effort, he did argue that, as he says, as long as the impossibility of the effort, he doesn't think it's going to make it against all odds, is unproven, as long as it's unproven, it's morally impossible to renounce the attempt. We are obliged to make an effort against all odds. So, thank you very much for your attention. I have gotten rid of the screen share.
Well, thank you so much, Babette, for this beautiful and profound talk. Now, I'm going to ask the first question here, and everyone else, please feel free to write down your question on the chat, or just open your mic and speak up for yourself. Now, in your book and in your talk, you pointed out that for Anders, our preoccupation with technology is preternaturally religious, filling the void or wake of what Hegel, in his Phenomenology of Spirit, had already announced well before Nietzsche as the death of God. Of course, some tend to demonize technology, while others tend to glorify it. Now, what do you make of a technological apocalypse nowadays, as we see an incipient cyber war going on between China, Russia, the US, and other players on the geopolitical chessboard?
Thank you. That's such a hard question, though. You ask so many things. The reference to Hegel, which is very important, people can forget that it's not Nietzsche who is the source of the death of God reference, and it is crucially Hegel. But Hegel, of course, I think also lurks a little bit in this very important conclusion to your question, because there's also, again, a synthesis or a kind of culmination. But then what Anders would say, because he's very Heideggerian, despite his criticism, is that you still have something going on in the face in what you're doing. We are, think of the year 2000. Now, Anders didn't live long enough to notice this, but you know, Baudrillard did. And Jean Baudrillard is merciless. He doesn't forgive us for believing that the world will fall apart because there's not an extra space for an extra zero. And this was the reason everyone worried. Oh my God, no, we only have, you know, 2 numbers. What are we going to do when we need 4? Well, we need 4 now because 2021, but we've gone back to saying 21. Because the problem is that that's not the source of the problem. There is still an overestimation of what it can do. And this is one of the things that's why I hope that his first book does get translated, and part of it is available. Christopher John Müller has a great, in his Prometheanism, he has a part of that, very accessible, and it's so, you need to read it so slowly because it's difficult to read. Who's he talking about? We don't know. But, and when is he talking? In the 50s, who remembers LA then? Nobody, except all the Germans who went there. That was like a little Germany on the Pacific was Pacific Palisades. They all were there. Very interesting. And there was Anders, and there was Adorno. And what were they talking about? Technology. And what did it do? It made you feel inadequate. You felt less. You were not as good. The problem is that this fantasy that technology is more adequate. That's why my favorite film for technology is RoboCop. I will always love RoboCop. Why? Not the later ones, the first one, because they show you that the robots are very bad at running, and they especially cannot go downstairs. They cannot go downstairs. They cannot make steps. Real dogs can't, but it doesn't stop Boston Robotics from designing robot dogs. They're thinking that'll be okay. But 4 legs don't deal well any more than 2 robot legs do with steps. We can go downstairs, but it's hard for us too. It hurts our joints, but we can do it. That ability to, we don't appreciate what we as human beings can do. Nietzsche has a beautiful statement. We're not as proud or as happy as we might be. And I think that has to do with our physicality, even our current debate about natural immunity. We seem to have forgotten everything I ever learned about that. It's quite crazy, you know, as if you weren't capable of mounting an immune response in your body to all kinds of things. There's all kinds of things, germs around you. But we've forgotten that. We think only can be done by vaccines. Now, this is not true, but we overestimate the vaccine and we overestimate the robots. And I think we might be overestimating the incipient cyber war, because every so often such wars happen, and every so often nothing happens. So it's not totally true, but it is a lot true, because every so often Korea or somebody trying to do it shuts down a few things. But there's so many different things. It's the same thing we tell our students when they're applying for a job. Be careful what you put on the internet, because it's everywhere. One of the interesting things about the World Wide Web is the existence of servers everywhere. In your computer, in fact. I mean, in point of fact, Windows especially, but also Macs, there's no superiority. Simply are the way your iPhone is, a little beaming device to beam your signal to everybody else around you. So it's one of the most dangerous devices to have, because you're a transmitter, you're a walking transmitter, which is why it's so hot. It's constantly radiating a signal to make, it's very communist, to make all of the other iPhone users happy by allowing them to get a cell signal. We're not talking Wi-Fi. So the interesting phenomenon is that we overestimate what it can do, underestimate what the complexity actually means, because no one who works in cybernetics today knows how to write code. Even those who know how to write code don't know how to write code, because a long time ago, people started copying code to write code. So they pasted, they cut and paste, and all the mistakes went into the next program, which is one of the reasons everything is so gigantic. Why you need so much space for almost nothing, because they never went back and took out the mistakes. They just wrote in a code line that would fix it, but the whole mess is still in there.
That's interesting.
So
well,
that's my attempt at an answer to your very difficult question.
Well, thank you, Babette. Here we have Ed Emmer, our good friend.
Oh, really?
has joined us, Charles Zimmer.
Here's Ed. Hi, Ed. I have Ed, but why don't I see Ed? I want to see Ed. I've got to get a full screen here. What is this? It doesn't give me. Ed, say something.
Hey.
There you are.
How you doing?
Good to see you. Use the technology.
Yeah. So I would say I have two questions. One, clearly what you're saying is highly abbreviated. But if I understand the main point of what you're saying about technology is that the focus on these different technologies is always a focus on the wrong end of the stick, namely using technology to solve the problems created by technology instead of using technology to create the problem. If I understand, that's your wider point.
No, I think to the extent that I'm following Anders, I left that out, but to the extent that I'm following Anders, he thinks that it's both ends of the stick. He thinks it's both, but that doesn't matter. I think that there are problems on both sides of the situation for Anders at least. But in the part that I was talking about, there is ignoring some of the low-tech solutions. Which is my simple. It's kind of dumb. Stop. And I do that especially with regard. I'm a great admirer of Donald Worcester's book on nature's economy. He's a geographer, was at Kansas for a while, and he has a great discussion of what happened to America, starting from Thoreau's time, by not stopping, and how can you get it back again? And only a place like the land-grant universities or Kansas can even begin to think about that. I know nothing about this except I was once at such a university, and it blew my mind because that particular concept is often missing from our discourse.
Yeah, you had mentioned these man-made earthquakes,
yes,
which we feel every few months here in Emporia, Kansas, because of the fracking in Oklahoma. Again, I feel like I'm missing something here, but it sounds like what you're saying is the wrong approach is to say, well, what we need to do is make houses better at withstanding earthquakes instead of not fracking.
I agree with that completely. I really do, because of course the fracking is also from the perspective of water particularly disastrous, because fracking only works if you use an immense amount of absolutely pure water. So your water table has to be destroyed. That's the physicality of how those earthquakes happen, because that's really literally the water is the fluid between the layers of rock. So it's a big, it's huge, and it goes along all of the way, and they have to, because they can't make fracking fluid without chemicals plus water to get the right amount of percentage that they require. They require pure H2O. It's almost uncannily like in New York, you're not allowed, if you've been vaccinated, to donate blood because they need pure plasma. So it's a big problem. Mm-hmm. Pure water, H2O, pure. Not, you can't clean it. It has to be pure, which says something about our capacity to clean our water. So it's a big thing. So you really want that aquifer water. So the fracking industry pipes out water at an immense rate, in order to not have to, otherwise they have to schlep in the water, and they don't do it. They just take it from where they are, and then there are problems. So what you're pointing to is brilliant. Thank you, but that's complicated. You had another question though, which.
Well, maybe it's a side. You were talking about being in music and the question of religious experience, and it made me think of these new sort of performative neo-pagan bands like Heilung, which create very ritualistic performances, which many participants experience as quasi-religious.
Brilliant. I think I'm in correspondence, and I've recently written something on one of Anders' epitaphs, because he snuck a poem into his footnote, but it turns out that poem inspired the Neue Köln, the studio Babette Babich, who was one of the composers there, who then corresponded. They're both students of Scheler. It's crazy, and made this overlayered experience. Now, if a person reads my essay and doesn't go to that YouTube and see what's going on, and there are a bunch of them, and some of them are wrong because some of them are just encounters with a recording, but the ones that actually give you more of an effort to get you into the it's using tape, it's using the radio studio as if it were an instrument, which is one of the interesting things that you really get to learn a lot about when you're reading Anders. He's a trained sociologist of music, and who just happened not to have gotten anywhere at all. And I think some of his reflections are tremendously useful for us, because certainly the Husserlians never made anything of it. They're very bad. They say, oh yes, we have it, but they hate the people who wrote on it, like Smith and Joseph Smith, who was like miserable till he died. It's like the Husserlians hate me. So there's a silence on acoustic phenomenology that I think is partly because no Anders, but also partly because Husserl wasn't quite there although he's the source. He's the one who shows you how you do that phenomenological free variation, how you can do that, if you read Husserl. It's very different from the kind of thing Heidi will say where you're moving your eye, which anybody can do just in a moment with a tiny diagram. It's very, very different to do that with the Doppler effect in a certain sense, but all of us do and know how. And it's a very funny thing, but it doesn't go further if you're simply at the level of what you just described is leagues ahead of the idea of a deaf man tapping with the cane. It's not, or blind man, pardon me. It's not the same, because you just got one echo. But when you have layers, when you have acoustic, when the experience, when you have a drone experience, oh my God, or any of the other, people go to nightclubs and hop up and down, not me, obviously, because I don't know anything about it, but hop up and down for hours because of this religious dimension. It certainly is ecstatic, at least that, if it's not mystical.
Thank you, Babette. Camila has a question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for this amazing presentation. We have a lot to take in for it. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the relationship with today's view of technology with democracy. Because I was thinking about it when you were talking that most of these wars and events that you were bringing to us as a form of critique is usually associated with state and with the use to war specifically. And I think that if you think of the technologies of media today, as YouTube, Facebook, whatever, we have this perception of instrument of the people. So like a shift of power. Although I know that we have a big discussion about surveillance, and actually the states are paying the money for this kind of research to the development. But I believe that in the social unconscious, we perceive technology as a manifestation of democracy, of a more democratic development. And I know that a lot, I recently read Castell's book, Rupture, that he talks about the impact of internet to this, to minority groups, to identification, and to a more democratic view of the world, a more participant and democratic view that kind of takes this power of the hand of the state, as we are talking in other events that you were mentioning in your lecture. So I was wondering if you have anything related to consider about how we perceive technology as a manifestation of a more democratic process.
Yes, I hear what you're saying, and I think that there's a lot of truth to it. One of the reasons I have such joy in being able to talk to my old friend Ed is because secretly I follow him. I lurk on Facebook and see what he does. We get to see each other that we have not seen for a long time. And this is a simulacrum, this is a fantasy, but it's it's more than just a passing thought where someone might come across our mind, et cetera, because you've got a picture. You also have a novelty of something that you didn't know that they were doing. And it's sort of like, oh, really? And you can, but it's perfect because you can mute it. So one of the problems is what we call that social, that envelope or that bubble effect. It's the bubble we make ourselves democratically, subversively ourselves, our friends, et cetera, we get together, grassroots. But what's invisible, although they tell us that they're doing it. I mean, I just posted something and Facebook duly said, this is false. And I wrote, this is not false. But they also said, and anything we say is false will be hidden. So one of the things I'm fascinated by is media archaeology. But you need to be able to have evidence to do an archaeology. You need fragments, you need bits, you need something. A shadow ban means that only you see. What you see is not what other people get, but it's what you get. And that danger that you can literally be looking into a mirror rather than windows, as we very, very, very revealingly call this. And that's what we're doing right now, looking into each other's lives for a little bit, those of us who are actually allowing it, because as in most Zoom instruction that I've been doing for the last 2 years, almost everyone is not there. They are behind a name, which permits them not to be there. And by not being there, while pretending to be there, that overflows on them as well. So it changes democracy. So I think because I'm married to a political theorist, I find myself talking and thinking more about it than I normally would do. But I think you'll need another political theory to try to negotiate that, because if youth, I mean, that's always been true in America. People think their vote counts. They think it makes a difference. Even after they're told that it doesn't, especially if it's a presidential election, your vote is not relevant. I guess it is in a vague way. No, it's not. It does not count. The Electoral College counts, and the Electoral College is a complicated thing, which you need a PhD and various lots of study to understand even how that functions, etc. In addition, since hacking democracy, which is what I think you need to look at, directly to answer your question, it's on HBO. It's free. You can see it on YouTube, the entire thing. One of the things it shows you is that fabricating false results in elections is completely undetectable, meaning you can do it with impunity and no one can ever tell, ever. It's very, very much like changing those zeros, but it's not the 2000 disaster we were thinking about, but it's simply the fact that there is no way ever to know. It's very, very much like our access, because of the Hathi Trust in the United States, to any book that we can get online. You may not look at the physical book. That's one of the conditions. So the condition for having digital access to the text, which is completely manipulable as a digital fabrication, it's totally changeable. You can make it say whatever you want it to say. The only way you would ever know that is if you could compare it to the actual archival work, but you can't by law, not in the United States. And you can't see it at all in England. I know, because I live there most of the time. So you cannot even see it. But if you could see it, you couldn't see the original, even if the library holds the original copy. So it's a very, very terrible thing. Every so often librarians get upset about this, because mostly they're happy to give access without having to actually go to the stacks. It's like, yay, good, here's a PDF. But it has huge consequences, because someone cleverly arranged that the absolute plasticity of the PDF, it's completely editable. You can change them. They misquoted a text of mine. I said I was quoting a Kemp Smith, and they quoted for some reason because they like it, the Cambridge edition, because it was easy to copy from online. And I said Kemp Smith. So I went back into my PDF, put the Kemp Smith back, and put up the corrected version. The only correction is Kemp Smith. But it's easy to do that. And you would never know unless you go and get the original thing, which I haven't even seen, and no one ever sees, and so on. Does that make any sense to you?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you, Babette. There is another question here. Well, it's actually related to your second comment on Ed's question. Would you say that Rilke's bringing together poetry and Schema in the light of Anders Arendt's reading could be regarded as a correlation of acoustic imaging that could break away from essentialist conceptions of representation and correspondence theories of truth? Is there anything like a metaphorics of hearing and listening at play here?
It would be. One of the worries is, of course, that Anders is writing in German. And the reason that I tried to say, let's look at Hölderlin is not just a fetishism, it's also because that particularly strange poem, An die Nacht, to the night, just had such an effect. It's not the Poems of Madness. It's just a very beautiful poem, but you know, it's erotic. It has wonderful kinds of components to it. Rilke comes to that, but it's all about a certain kind of das alles war Auftrag, all of its assignment, all of its task, all of it is specification, submission, you must. Well, that's very, very hard to unpack. So the hearing and listening, which is certainly there, is very, very hard. How do we get this herd of mein Herz? How do we even do? It's Adorno, who's not interested in this stuff at all, in his Beethoven, has very, very similar strange reflections on the heart and on hearing. And he's not doing what Anders is doing, and yet he is doing a phenomenology, a very interesting one. So it's very interesting and an uncanny thing that's happening there. Listening is what Anders really brings us if we want anything from him, zuhören. But what Anders is doing is saying that not everybody can. And I don't know that we like that, but he wants to say that you need to be a musician to listen to music. Same thing Adorno says, and we've hated Adorno for years because he said that. It's like, oh my God, elitist. But Anders comes and says, there's an exclusionary thing going on as well. So I would say that Anders can also teach us to listen, even in a musical context and even in a question of paying attention to what this listening would be, because as I hope maybe you saw a little bit of, when you go inside that text, you really can pay a little bit of attention in the context of love and the context of destitution and abandonment. I mean, that's really what they go through, because that's what the Duino Elegies goes through. This is men who sometimes use women and don't and abandon them. So there's a lot of harshness there. But inside of that, or God, because Anders is saying you're absolutely in a condition of negative theology, because whatever you may think about God, there's no God because he's not answering. And that's enough for you because you turn that into a theology because you're inventive. But there's, which is the point he's trying to make there, is that somehow that's always operative, if that makes any sense. It's a very complicated question. Is there a follow-up on that? Because that would help me.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, I really appreciated where you mentioned about the phenomenology of acoustic metaphors, right? I was actually thinking of Nietzsche's own way, young Nietzsche's metaphorics of truth, etc. I know that very known text on the extramoral approach to truth, right? In Nietzsche, but exactly, precisely because it's referring to listening and hearing as opposed to seeing and thinking of written words. I thought it was very interesting what you said about Husserl, that and of course Adorno, yeah, it makes a lot of sense what you're saying. Yeah, I really appreciate that. Well, I don't know, Ed, Camila, anyone else would like to ask another question? We're reaching our 6:30 time here in Brazil. Well, it's supposed to be 4:30 p.m. in New York, right?
In New York, it's now coming on 4:27, so it is coming on indeed to 4:30, and I'm actually delighted that I was able to jump in.
Yeah.
Early,
well, thank you so much.
I was definitely not going to be ready before 4.
And I'm sorry again about this last minute notice, but it was only at the very last moment that we realized that there was this daylight time saving change.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you also. It's also sheer pleasure to see you again. And also, Ed, thank you very much for this great opportunity to say hi across all the miles.
Well, thank you guys. Once again, welcome to these ongoing discussions. Anytime you want to jump in and take part in any of these
Any
conversations,
Friday that
we're going to be
that
inviting you back. And
Okay.
Ed as well, you're going to be
Ed's going to give a
one of the
talk.
next speakers. Yeah, at
When
some
is Ed
point.
talking? When is
Yeah.
Ed talking? Ed should talk. I will
Yeah,
come.
and Ed's going to say something about Kant's third critique, something
What?
regarding.
What is he doing now? Really?
I don't know if he's still working on that. It was the topic of his doctoral dissertation many years ago.
Oh, yeah. That's very interesting, though. Every time I teach aesthetics, I think of Ed.
Right.
Definitely.
All right, guys.
Just
You
fine.
guys
Thank
have
you
a
very
nice
much for this
weekend.
virtual fun thing, also for
Nice week.
association with friends. Cheers to everyone. Cheers.
Cheers. Have a nice weekend. Thank you, Babette. See you,
Bye.
Ed. Take care, guys.
Thank you again. And bye. Yes, thank you. Camila, if I may. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Clap, clap to everyone. Bye.
Bye.